Welcome back to Reading Together. We're continuing our jaunt through the spirit of the disciplines, understanding how God changes life. A great book by Dallas Willard. We are continuing in chapter 9 today. Started chapter 9 last time. This is a really long chapter with lots of heavy-duty material in it as Willard starts examining particular disciplines. We saw last time that he divides the disciplines up into disciplines of abstinence and disciplines of engagement. We looked at that general framework last week. Today, we're just going to be looking at an overview of what he calls the disciplines of abstinence, the disciplines which are different ways of saying no to something. Let's dive right in here. I'm going to share my screen for those of you that are watching the video version. Here we go. Format here, again, is that we look at a quote from the book, and then we talk about it. This is a quote from William Inge, I-N-G-E. Willard quotes him as saying, "If we feel that any habit or pursuit, harmless in itself, is keeping us from God and sinking us deeper in the things of earth, if we find that things which others can do with impunity are for us the occasion of falling, then abstinence is our only course. It is necessary that we should steadily resolve to give up anything that comes between ourselves and God." Now, you notice the key idea here, and Willard's going to go into this over and over again, is that the things we're abstaining from in the disciplines of abstinence are not bad things. They're not things that are wrong, not things that are immoral, but they're things that sometimes for us, we need to set aside. Sometimes for us, we need to set it aside for a time or for right now or under certain circumstances. It might be good things that we're misusing, and we need to learn to use better. So it's not that these things are bad. And that's why, one reason why the list of disciplines that Willard gives us is not complete, it's not entire, it's not exhaustive, because there are some things that he's not going to mention that we're going to have to give up at some point. I think back to a time when I was younger. I think this is when I was a college student. I was really an addict to reading science fiction books. I just read one after another, lots and lots of science fiction books. And I came to the point where I was convicted that I needed to give that up for a while. So I collected all my science fiction books and magazines and gave them away and dropped it cold turkey. Now, it's not because I was convinced that reading science fiction was bad or evil or ungodly. And it could be sometimes, at least for some people. But for me at that time, that was something that was coming between myself and God. It was coming between myself and where I wanted to be with God. I needed to set it aside. Maybe as you listen to this today, God's putting his finger on something in your heart, something in your life, something that isn't bad. Maybe it's even something really good, a blessing. But right now, it's coming between you and God. It's coming between you and your life with God. You might want to consider a way to abstain from it. Next, he goes in and talks about abstinence in general. He says, in the disciplines of abstinence, we abstain to some degree and for some time from the satisfaction of what we generally regard as normal and legitimate desires. Remember, this is the focus again. It's not that we're abstaining from bad or evil things. That's taken for granted. We don't do bad things. We don't do evil things. But this is, as he says, to some degree and for some time, we abstain from the satisfaction of what we generally regard as normal for normal people. They're legitimate. He says these include things like food. We see the discipline of fasting, sleep, bodily activity, companionship, curiosity, sex. All these are good things according to God. All these are good things we see in Scripture. But sometimes we need to give them up for a while. Willard also mentioned some other things that we might need to abstain from sometimes. He lists convenience, comfort, material security, our need for having a good reputation, and variety. Man, that last one, variety, man, I love variety. I thrive on variety. Sometimes in my life, people have asked me what my favorite food is. And I, with difficulty, will name something as, okay, this is my favorite food. This is something I'd really like to have. Now, a lot of times when I say that, I mean, it's something I haven't had in a while, and I'd really like to have it. And then that person comes to believe that I want it every time they see me. And there's almost no food that I want all the time. I thrive on variety. When I hear of places or cultures where they eat basically the same food every day, man, that sounds like torture to me. And convenience. We really love convenience. We like having things at hand. We like being able to get up and go when we need to. We like to have resources at our disposal. And yet sometimes it's good for us to abstain from convenience, to set up our lives in such a way where we need to depend on God and not having everything ready to hand. Willard mentions the 7 deadly sins. As you probably know, these are not original to Willard. These go back to ancient times in the Christian tradition. Traditional lists are pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lasciviousness, or lust. Some people translate it as lust. Willard says that each of these is a case of one or more legitimate desires. What is that? Legitimate desires, desires for good things that have gone wrong, things that we're doing wrongly, things that we're handling wrongly. He goes on, by the carefully adapted arrangement of our circumstances and behavior, the spiritual disciplines will bring these basic desires into their proper coordination and subordination within the economy of life in his kingdom. So again, as we said, the very first of this podcast, these things that we're abstaining from are almost entirely good things. But by abstaining from them, we're learning to order them properly, healthfully in our life with God, so that every area of our life is in alignment with God's kingdom, with God's character, with God's ways and God's purposes. The first discipline of abstinence that Willard looks at is solitude. He says, in solitude, we purposefully abstain from interaction with other human beings, denying ourselves companionship and all that comes from our conscious interaction with others. Solitude is choosing to be alone and to dwell on our experience of isolation from human beings. Okay, I'm going to the next one and before I talk about it. It says the normal course of day-to-day human interactions locks us into patterns of feeling, thought, and action that are geared to a world set against God. Nothing but solitude can allow the development of a freedom from the ingrained behaviors that hinder our integration into God's order. I felt really convicted on solitude this summer. Preached a message on it back, I think it was in August, July or August, on the value of solitude and my lack of it. Now, solitude isn't the same thing as just not being around other people. Nowadays, we have lots of ways of being around other people without being around other people. I think of social media. I spend a lot of time in my office, spend a lot of time alone without other people right around me, but social media, get out there. Solitude and social media, they don't mix. Whether I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever we are, wherever we're thinking, imagining other people around us. It's not solitude, but in solitude, and I need that solitude. I really felt that hunger this summer. That was that hunger for that. It was restored in me. In solitude, I give God space, God room to get into my life, to get it speak into my heart without all the noise that's out there. How are you doing on solitude? Are you allowing yourself any solitude, any time away from others? I know that if you're a parent, especially a parent of young children, especially if you're a mom of young children, solitude is really, really hard to come by. And one of the things I also felt convicted about lately is finding ways to allow my wife to get some solitude. We don't have young children at home, but we have a disabled adult child at home who can be very demanding sometimes. So I seek solitude for myself. I also try to find ways to help other people find some solitude. One of the things Willard says about it here, he says the normal course of day-to-day human interactions locks us into patterns of feeling, thought, and action that are geared to a world set against God. As long as we're engaging with people in the world, this world that is set up, or as he said here, geared against God, it sets up thought patterns in our life, sets up desiring patterns that can take us away from God. It might not be in the direction of what we might call evil or sinful things, but at the very least, it takes us off into busyness and distraction. We need deliverance from those things. Willard says, in solitude, we find the psychic distance. The word psychic comes from the Greek word psyche, which means soul. We find the distance for our souls, the perspective from which we can see in the light of eternity the created things that trap, worry, and oppress us. You felt trapped lately? You felt worried lately, or anxious, or oppressed? Willard's claim here is that as we give ourselves over to solitude, then we can come to see things from God's point of view. We can come to experience them His way and with His assessment of them. It's very helpful. Helps deliver us from the feeling of being trapped. Helps deliver us from the anxieties the world's continually pushing our way. They can deliver us from the oppressions that we feel. There's a danger with solitude. Willard says, solitude, like all of the disciplines of the Spirit, carries its risks. In solitude, we confront our own soul with its obscure forces and conflicts that escape our attention when we are interacting with others. Yeah, there's that busyness. A lot of times we're in busyness so that we can hide from ourselves, we can hide from God. Man, we can even be busy at church and hide from God. And it's not just us professional Christians that can do that. Any Christian can do that. We put our nose to the grindstone. We focus so much on what we're doing that we miss God. He continues, and this is quoting Lewis Boyer, solitude is a terrible trial, for it serves to crack open and burst apart the shell of our superficial securities. It opens out to us the unknown abyss, the deep pit that we all carry within us, and discloses the fact that these abysses are haunted. We can only survive solitude if we cling to Christ there. There's a danger in solitude. We can, as we see our world, as we see our lives, as we see our investments, our desires, our activities, our busyness for what it is, we can feel condemnation. We can feel that emptiness. But that's why at the same time, we cling to Christ. We hold on to Him. We seek Him with all of our heart. It's not solitude apart from Christ, but it's solitude with Christ. It goes on to talk about another danger of solitude. Solitude will also pain and threaten our family and friends. Others need us to keep their lives in place. And when we retreat, they then have to deal with their souls. True, they need God more than they need us, but they may not understand this. When we withdraw from people in solitude, we're pulling ourselves back from those networks of relationships that we live in. We need those networks of relationship. That's part of life, part of the life that God designed for us. It's a good thing to live in those networks of relationship. But sometimes we need to draw back. And sometimes when we do that, the holes that we leave are burdensome to our family, to our friends, to our coworkers. And yet it's for our own spiritual health that we withdraw into solitude. And it's also for the health of the people around us. Because sometimes when we withdraw, they learn to depend on God instead of on us. Because sometimes in our relationships, sometimes it's as parents, sometimes it's as husbands and wives, sometimes it's as pastors, we end up falling into the place of God for people, where the expectations that they should put on God, they put on us. We don't ask for it. Well, maybe we don't ask for it. Sometimes we do. We don't ask for it, but they put it on us. So it's good for us to withdraw from those expectations into solitude. And it's good for the people around us. So they learn to trust in God and not just in us. Willard says that the discipline of solitude is fundamental. He says of all the disciplines of abstinence, solitude is generally the most fundamental. In the beginning, notice the beginning of the spiritual life. And it must be returned to again and again as that life develops. Just try fasting, prayer, service, giving, or even celebration without the preparation accomplished in withdrawal. And you will soon be thrown into despair by your efforts, very likely abandoning your attempt altogether. These other disciplines of abstinence, fasting, prayer, service, giving, these are good for us. But Willard's claim is that solitude becomes a foundation, becomes the fundament on which we can build these other disciplines, on which we can have the character, on which we can have the reliance on Jesus that enable us to pull them off. Next, we see Willard considering a Thoreau. He says, as our inward life fails, we go more constantly and desperately to the post office. Now, we don't go constantly and desperately to the post office anymore. Maybe when we were younger, maybe it's not the post office, but it's the mailbox. But the poor fellow who walks away with the greatest number of letters, proud of his extensive correspondence, had not heard from himself this long while. We get so dependent on the feedback from others. We go to social media. How many likes do we have? How many shares do we have? How many comments do we have? How many people are acknowledging our existence, our presence, our performance, our expression? And we find our life on what people are feeding back to us on social media. And yet, in solitude, we retreat from that. We go off with God. We go off with ourselves. We learn to listen to God. We learn to listen to our own soul. Next, turn to the discipline of silence. Willard says, in silence, we close off our souls from sounds, whether those sounds be noise, music, or words. Total silence is rare. And what we today call quiet usually only amounts to a little less noise. We find complete silence shocking, because it leaves the impression that nothing is happening. In a go world such as ours, what could be worse than that? Because go, yeah, you got to be part of it. You got to be in the crowd. You got to be moving. You got to be active. It's not often we get total silence. Remember 25 years ago living in Southern California. We lived in Orange County, and yeah, there are parts of Orange County that aren't populated, but where we are, it was city on city on city. And there was noise 24/7. If it wasn't the noise from a car alarm going off in the parking lot of our condo complex, or cars on the road out front, or the noise roaring from the distant freeway, it was airplanes landing at the airport, or helicopters searching for criminals, or something like that. Constant noise. And I remember one time driving up to visit my uncle, who lived about halfway up the coast in California, Pismo Beach area, if that means anything to you. And we could have gone up the 101. The 101 was probably the fastest normal route. If you look in your Google Maps or MapQuest, that's the road it would take you. But I didn't like going the same way twice. So I decided, hey, it'd be cool to go up the 5 and we'll cut through the mountains. We'll take this state highway that goes out there in the middle of nowhere. And I remember getting off there on the highway, and we were up at a mountain someplace. I remember seeing a roadside park. And just on the spur of the moment, I pulled off and we walked around for a little bit. And it was utterly silent, utterly quiet. All I heard was a gentle breeze. No cars, no airplanes, no helicopters, no radio, no TV. It was silent. And the silence stood out because it was so unusual, so strange. It was almost loud. I also think of something else I've done before. I haven't done it in a while. I used to do this at Lakeview, our Methodist camp that's not too far from here. I'd be walking down the trail or the sidewalk, and I just closed my eyes as I walked. And I'd listen to the trees. And well, there's more than one way to listen to a tree. One, you might listen to it as it sways in the wind, as the leaves rustle. But what I was thinking of was listening to the trees and the way the trees, and I remember they used to have big pine trees along the path I'm thinking of before a tornado or straight line winds or something came and took them out. There's big old pine trees. And as I walked past a pine tree with my eyes closed, I could hear it. What I heard was the silence coming from it because the pine tree, the soft bark absorbed the sound. And I could hear other noises echoing around. Might be nature sounds, might be a group off doing some sort of game somewhere at the camp. But I walked by the tree and I heard that silence. I think even today, how much I miss out on silence. I always feel the need to be learning, so I'm reading. Reading is something I usually do silently, but it's words coming at me. I go walking and I listen to podcasts, or I'm driving the car, I listen to music or a podcast, always sound coming at me. And I learn a lot. I'm sure it's good for me. But I'm being convicted that I need more silence, more time to listen to God, more time to listen to my soul. Willard goes on, silence goes beyond solitude, and without solitude has little effect. Silence is frightening because it strips us as nothing else does, throwing us upon the stark realities of our life. It reminds us of death, which will cut us off from this world and leave only us and God. Think what it says about the inward emptiness of our lives. If we must always turn on the tape player or radio to make sure something is happening around us. Silence. Can you handle silence? Do you have any silence in your life? If you're not used to silence, if you haven't had it for a while, it might be that you need to just take a short time. 5 minutes, try 5 minutes of silence. If you've been to any of the worship services at the church I serve in Fairfield, you'll notice that sometimes we have silence. Right now, while we're still in the midst of the pandemic, our 9 o'clock worship service is outside. And there are always noises out there because our church is right near downtown. Now, downtown in a city of 3,000 is not downtown in a metropolis, but it still sounds. Hear sirens, trucks going by on the highway, cars, birds. There's birds out there. Can you believe it? Birds chirping, maybe even a squirrel occasionally. But we also have elements of silence because in worship, we think we always have to be talking or listening to something. Music playing, somebody talking, sometimes somebody talking with music in the background. but silence. In our outdoor service, we have silence during our offering time. When we were doing our contemporary worship indoors at 9 before the pandemic, we did communion every Sunday. And we could have had music playing in the background for that. People like music. There's always music that's appropriate for communion. But that was a time where we had silence. Silence has a place in worship. Silence has a place in our lives. And I don't think we give it enough room. Willard talks about experimentation. He says, as with all disciplines, we should approach the practice of silence in a prayerful, experimental attitude, confident that we shall be led into its right use for us. It allows us to hear the gentle God whose only Son shall not strive nor cry, neither shall many hear his voice above the street noise. Jesus speaks quietly. When we experiment with silence, we go into silence. It maybe gives us room to hear him, space to hear him. Goes on to talk not just about silence around us, but us being silent, not speaking. He says practice in not speaking can at least give us enough control over what we say that our tongues do not go off automatically. This discipline provides us with a certain inner distance that gives us time to consider our words fully and the presence of mind to control what we say and when we say it. Some of us have a propensity of not having any filter between what we think and what we say. The thought pops in our head, we say it. Something happens in the world, we speak at it. Might be verbal words coming out. It might be what we type on social media, commenting. But this practice of not speaking, thinking carefully, of controlling our tongues, it's an essential discipline for us. It helps us to represent Jesus better. Goes on and ties silence to listening. He says the practice of silence also helps us to listen and to observe, to pay attention to people. Wonder how much wrath in human life is a result of not being heard. Yet when the tongue is moving rapidly, it seems wrath will usually be found following it. There's a lot of hurting people out there, a lot of lonely people, a lot of discouraged and despairing people, a lot of angry people. How much would their lives be changed? How much would our lives be changed if we took time to listen to them? If instead of thinking, oh, we need to come to them with a message, we need to come and figure out what to say. A lot of times we don't have any clue what to say, but that means we don't fill the space with our speech anyway. The Willard says, be silent, listen, hear people. Goes on and connects silence to witnessing. He says in witnessing, the role of talking is frequently overemphasized. Silence, and especially true listening, are often the strongest testimony to our faith. A major problem for Christian evangelism is not getting people to talk, but to silence those who through their continuous chatter reveal a loveless heart, devoid of confidence in God. There's a famous saying associated with Francis of Assisi. I've seen claims that he never said it, but people associate it with him. It's the saying, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. Now, I get that. I get the idea that preaching the gospel is a showing of the gospel, a showing of the good news. But I also, as I read the New Testament, don't see a separation from preaching the gospel, from witnessing, and words. The words are always there. But Willard's claim here, and I have to agree with him on this, is our words overwhelm our witness sometimes. Sometimes, as he says, our words are just continuous chatter. And our witness could be so much more powerful if we listened. And if we had confidence in God to do the speaking and not just us. It might be, that God calls us to say something. But then to let that something stew in somebody's heart, in their mind for a while. It's so much more important in witnessing that we show a loving heart and confidence in God. Next, we turn to fasting. Fasting, according to Willard, is abstaining from food in some significant way. Normally, fasting is, just abstaining from all food. Sometimes it's abstaining from sweet, sometimes from meat, sometimes from rich food, sometimes from excessive food, sometimes from a meal, sometimes from multiple meals. Willard says, this discipline teaches us a lot about ourselves very quickly. It will certainly prove humiliating to us as it reveals how much our peace depends upon the pleasures of eating. It may also bring to mind how we are using food pleasure to assuage the discomforts caused in our bodies by faithless and unwise living and attitudes, lack of self-worth, meaningless work, purposeless existence, or lack of rest or exercise. If nothing else, it will certainly demonstrate how powerful and clever our body is in getting its own way against our strongest resolves. I understand that, our body having its own way against our strongest resolves. I can resolve not to eat something, not to go get dessert, not to snack, and I go and do it anyway. Fasting is a discipline that helps us bring our body into order, helps bring our bodies into line with God, our physical existence. God loves us. God made us to eat. God made us so we need food. We need to take in nourishment. But so often we become more reliant on food, more reliant on what we eat and snack on and drink than we are on God. Willard continues, he says, fasting confirms our utter dependence upon God by finding in him a source of sustenance beyond food. Fasting is one of the more important ways of practicing that self-denial required of everyone who would follow Christ. In fasting, we learn how to suffer happily as we feast on God. Notice how strange that sounds, to suffer happily. But here we are, what are we suffering? Hunger pangs. We're suffering the desire to eat. We're suffering, I'm not going to eat that donut. No, I'm not going to eat that cookie. No, I can't join you for lunch today. And we don't have to tell them we can't join you for lunch today because we're fasting, because we're praying and seeking God. But fasting helps us to say no to ourselves, to our desires, to our own hungers. Next, come to the discipline of frugality. In frugality, we abstain from using our money or goods at our disposal in ways that merely gratify our desires or a hunger for status, glamour, or luxury. Oh, we like that, don't we? We like status. We like people thinking highly of us. We like being thought highly of. We like glamour. We like luxury. We like the best things in life. We like to be known as liking the best things in life. But in frugality, we're abstaining from using our money or our resources, our goods, to just gratify our desires. We're saying no to our desires. It might be that we have plenty of money. It might be that we're generous people too. And it's not a matter of that we're us being stingy or Scrooge-like. But it's by frugality that we learn also to say no to our desires and to bring them into line with God. Willard goes on, the spiritually wise person has always known that frivolous consumption, this isn't just frivolous consumption of food or drink, frivolous consumption of TV, movies, or one that strike me close are books. Frivolous consumption corrupts the soul away from trust in, worship of, and service to God, and injures our neighbors as well. Frivolous consumption. And we have to watch that. We can consume. We have the resources. And yet we say no to ourselves. Willard talks about debt. In our current world, a large part of the freedom that comes from frugality is freedom from the spiritual bondage caused by financial debt. Frugality as a settled style of life frees us from indifferent things. Indifferent things are things that don't matter. Things that, oh yeah, we get a great joy out of this for 10 minutes, for an hour, until the next new thing comes along. But through frugality, we get freedom from some of that. We stop going into debt to get things, even debt that we can afford. Come to chastity. Willard says, in exercising the spiritual discipline of chastity, we purposefully turn away from dwelling upon or engaging in the sexual dimension of our relationships to others, even our husbands and wives. God made us sexual beings. Sexuality in marriage is normal, entirely godly. I mean, God started things off saying, be fruitful and multiply. That's how we're fruitful and multiply. But through chastity, we're putting limits on our sexual expression, whether outside of marriage or even inside marriage. It's not the highest good. It's a good, but it's not the highest good. Willard points us at 1 Thessalonians 4:4, where it says, learn how to possess our vessel. And by our vessel there, it means our body, in sanctification and in honor. It says an essential part of this learning consists in the practice of abstaining from sex and from indulging in sexual feelings and thoughts, and thus learning how to not be governed by them. If you look at the world around us, so often we see people that are totally governed by them. They're controlled. They're at the beck and call of their sexual desires and thoughts. We see this so many times of powerful people. Say men especially fall into this. Say their wife has been pregnant. Wife is inaccessible for some reason, maybe traveling, maybe busy, maybe tired, burdened with children or work. The husband thinks, oh, I got to go do something else. Go to find another woman that's available. Or maybe I'll just feed my desires with porn because that doesn't hurt anybody, right? And yet in chastity, we're learning to order our sexual feelings, our sexual thoughts, our desires, so we're not governed by them, so they can be rightly used within the covenant of marriage. Looks to Bonhoeffer here. He says Bonhoeffer observes, now if you don't know Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German church leader in the World War II era. He led the confessing church in its stand for faithfulness to Christ against faithfulness to Hitler. Ended up costing him his life. It says Bonhoeffer observes that the essence of chastity is not the suppression of lust, but the total orientation of one's life toward a goal. Healthy abstention in chastity can only be supported by loving, positive involvement with the members of the opposite sex. Alienation from them makes room for harmful lust. Don't want harmful lust. To practice chastity, then, we must first practice love. Practice seeking the good of those of the opposite sex that we come in contact with at home, work, school, church, or next door. The idea is that we can be friends with, men can be friends with women, women can be friends with men, without being consumed by lust, without being consumed by sexual desire or seeking to use people. Turn to secrecy. In the discipline of secrecy, we abstain from causing our good deeds and qualities to be known. We learn to love to be unknown and even to accept misunderstanding without the loss of our peace, joy, or purpose. Yeah, God calls us to obey him. God calls us to bless others. And sometimes we feel the blessing in having other people recognize us for the good things we do. As a professional Christian, as one who does so much of my faith stuff in public, this is a harder one for me because I can't preach in secret. I can pray in secret, but so much of my prayer is public. My relationships are public. And yet there's this call from Jesus. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. This secrecy, so that I get my sense of affirmation, my feedback that affirms me as a being, as a decent person. comes from God and not from the people around me. Whether the people around me are reading me, understanding me, interpreting me correctly or not. It's what secrecy allows us to do. He continues, in the practice of secrecy, we experience a continuing relationship with God independent of the opinions of others. Oh man, we thrive in those opinions of others so often. What do they think of us? This is another area in which social media, it can be so dangerous because we're immersed in the opinions of others as they like what we post. They like the way we express ourselves, give us constant feedback, and we hunger for that. And yet we need secrecy, hiding our life. Willard continues, one of the greatest fallacies of our faith, and actually one of the greatest acts of unbelief, is the thought that our spiritual acts and virtues need to be advertised to be known. In other words, if we don't talk about them, if we don't do them up front of people, nobody's going to know, and they're not going to do any good. The gospel stories tell us, he says, how hard Jesus and his friends tried to avoid crowds and how badly they fail. I mean, Jesus would say, hey, I've just healed you. Don't tell anybody. Raised your daughter from the dead. Tell no one. Quite candidly, he continues, if it is possible for our faith and works to be hidden, perhaps that only shows they are of a kind that should be hidden. We might, in that case, think about directing our efforts toward the cultivation of a faith that is impossible to hide, a light that is on a hill, not hidden under a bushel basket. The idea that Willard's getting at here is that we don't need to advertise ourselves. Our life in Christ should leak out as people see, just in the way we live, without us pointing at ourselves at all. They can see our trusting him. They can see our reliance on him. They can see our joy in the midst of anxiety and turmoil. They can see that where the rest of the world is collapsing in outrage and anger and fear, we are not. And it makes them ask questions. Another benefit he talks about, the needs that arise in our efforts to serve God can often be handled by looking to God only, not telling others that there is a need, but counting on God to tell them. If we see needs met because we've asked God alone, our faith in God's presence and care will be greatly increased. Now, if you were reading in the book, you'd see how he goes here and talks about the story of George Mueller. George Mueller had an orphanage in Bristol, and he's a man of great faith. He was one that was notorious for not telling people what he needed. Might have a house full of orphans to feed, but doesn't tell them that he has no food. There's a famous story that he told about a time where it came morning and they had no food in their orphanage. And so the staff said, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do for the kids? And Mueller said, well, put out the plates. I've talked to God. God's going to provide. And right about that time, there was a knock on the door. And Mueller went to the door, and it was a bakery truck. And the baker comes out, and he's looking sort of embarrassed. And he said, well, I don't know what's going on here, but I had a dream in the night that God was telling me that y'all needed some food. So I got up in the middle of the night, and I baked some bread for you. Could you use some bread? He brings the bread in and sits it before the kids. And before he can even finish doing that, there's another knock on the door. And he goes to the door, and it's the guy with the milk wagon. And he says, I'm sorry, but my wheel's broken out here and my milk's going to spoil. So could your orphans by chance use some milk today? And God miraculously takes care of Mueller and his orphans through the years as he just lets his needs be known to God. A famous missionary that learned that kind of faith from Mueller was Hudson Taylor. If you read his biography, you'll read about him calling out to God when he has a need for his mission work in China. And God provides. And there's the discipline of sacrifice. Willard says, in the discipline of sacrifice, we abstain from the possession or enjoyment of what is necessary for living, not as in frugality, from what is really, to some degree, superfluous anyway. We forsake the security of meeting our needs with what is in our hands. It is total abandonment to God. We give up the good things. We give up the basic things for a time. and we trust in God. We see God come through and provide for us. There's a final comment on this section on the disciplines of abstinence. Willard says, the cautious faith that never saws off the limb on which it is sitting never learns that unattached limbs may find strange, unaccountable ways of not falling. Yeah, unaccountable doesn't make any sense, does it? You know what? You know the imagery here. You've climbed a tree, you're sitting on a limb, and you saw off the limb between where you are and where the tree is. So there's going to be nothing holding it up. I think what he's getting at here is our propensity to engineer our lives in such a way that we don't need God. But instead, this idea of sawing off the limbs is to just step out in faith sometimes. God, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to make it. Don't know how I'm going to pay the bills. Don't know where my food's going to come from. Don't know how I'm going to provide for my family. I don't know how I'm going to do this thing that you've called me to do, and I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to trust you. That's when our faith grows. So the more we engineer our lives to not need God, the more likely we are to have a shriveled, shrunken, and inconsiderable faith. So I'd suggest, as you look at these disciplines of abstinence, to start experimenting with them. Experiment with the first ones, solitude and silence. Go to try fasting, try frugality. Just pick a couple and try them out. See how they work. See how God works in your life through them. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for everyone who's listening today. I pray that this podcast will be a blessing to them. I pray that you make yourself known to them, that you would open up space in their life for you to transform them into the likeness of Jesus as they practice these disciplines of abstinence. Help us, Lord, to bring our desires, our bodily needs and urges into line with your word, to bring them into submission to your spirit, your kingdom rule. Amen. Well, thanks again for joining us this time. And in our next session, we'll be turning to the disciplines of engagement. Bye.